1993 East Providence, Rhode Island. A bathroom faucet was running, its steady trickle echoing across tile, and on the floor, in the pale light from a crooked window, lay 30-year-old Lori Lee Sled Dog Malloy still, her skin marked with fresh bruises along her thighs and arm. Her dark hair seemed scattered with intention rather than chance. Long strands coiled across the linoleum like threads of a ruptured story. A clump was wedged between the toes of one foot. Another was wrapped around her fingers. A third lay curled like a bracelet around her wrist. 2 drinking glasses sat on the kitchen table beside leftover salad, untouched but recently made. The refrigerator stood full, yet unplugged, humming with nothing. Nothing about the scene aligned. Nothing settled. And yet for decades the case would be spoken of as if it were simple. We begin here, in the doorway, in the quiet. The winter of 1993 had a way of settling into buildings in East Providence, thin layers of cold clinging to stair rails, creeping through window seams, tightening around every quiet corner. Lori Malloy's apartment was one of those places where the chill seemed permanent. But the morning she was found, the air held an odd, almost humid warmth, like someone had been moving through the rooms moments before help arrived. Officers stepped inside cautiously, their boots brushing through strands of hair on the floor, and for a moment, the apartment felt less like a residence and more like a paused moment something interrupted and left unfinished. The layout was small but functional, a cramped kitchen to the right, a narrow hallway straight ahead, and a bathroom tucked behind a partially closed door. The light inside the bathroom was off, yet enough sun slipped through the small window for officers to see her. Lori lay on her back, her body angled slightly toward the bathtub, legs flat, arms bent as if she had been trying to push herself up. Bruises the color of watered-down wine stretched along her inner thighs in clean, deliberate shapes patterns that didn't match accidental falls or sudden collapses. Her torso, limbs, and face told different stories depending on where one looked. Some areas appeared untouched, others carried fresh trauma. The faucet dripped in a maddening rhythm, each drop striking the metal drain with a plink that echoed around the small room. No one ever conclusively explained why the water had been left running. Some investigators believed the person responsible fumbled for the handle in panic. Others believed the running water was intentional, used to rinse something, dilute something, erase something. But nothing, not even the temperature of the water, had been documented in a way that offered clarity. Outside the bathroom, the details only grew stranger. 2 plates sat on the kitchen table, each with a portion of salad, as though dinner had been interrupted or shared. But the glasses beside them told a different story. One was half filled with water, the other was empty but marked with a faint lipstick smear, not a red bold tone, but a soft rose tint. Lori wore no makeup when she was found. One officer noticed the refrigerator wasn't running. Its plug lay coiled loosely on the floor. Inside, food sat spoiling in the warmth. Milk, lunch meat, leftovers. Nothing had been removed or tampered with. The entire appliance had simply been unplugged. The official report later claimed it may have been accidental, but the cord was positioned in a way that suggested someone had pulled it deliberately. Hair was everywhere, not scattered naturally, but placed or at least disturbed with purpose. A tightly bound clump wrapped around Lori's fingers. Another was clutched loosely in her palm. A smaller strand was wedged between her toes, as if stepped on during a struggle. The largest clump lay beside her hip, still moist at the roots, almost as if recently torn from a scalp. Not all of it matched Lori's color. The apartment itself showed no forced entry, no broken locks, no bruised door frames. But investigators noted something odd about the inside doorknob: faint smudges, not prints, suggestive of someone wiping it down but not thoroughly. A single fingerprint on the bathroom doorframe was later deemed unusable, partial, smudged, and of no forensic value. On the living room floor, near the couch, there was an overturned lamp, not shattered, just neatly on its side, bulb unbroken. A small detail, too small for the official report to linger on, but large enough that the responding officers mentioned it more than once. Nothing in the apartment spoke clearly. Every object contradicted another. Every detail created distance instead of answers. And in the center of it all was Lori, left in a posture that didn't belong to accidents, yet surrounded by a silence that resisted every attempt to explain her final moments. As investigators began to catalog the apartment, the inconsistencies multiplied, layering uncertainty over what should have been a straightforward scene. Radios initially used to coordinate officers outside began to emit low-level static when positioned near the bathroom. One detective, noting the odd interference on the walkie-talkie, recorded the frequency and attempted to replay transmissions later. The files contained segments of unintelligible speech, fragmented voices overlapping briefly with tones that seemed to bend and stretch unnaturally. Technicians would later note that no one in the immediate area was transmitting on that channel at the time. Top COMPASSES, brought in by search personnel, spun erratically. A simple check in the hallway showed deviations of 5 to 7 degrees, as if a magnetic anomaly emanated from somewhere within the apartment. No structural metalwork should have caused such interference. No natural formations existed inside the city block to explain it. yet the instruments recorded patterns that investigators could not reconcile. Each reading contradicted the next, and the anomaly persisted even after multiple resets. Thermal imaging scans of the apartment, conducted hours later, revealed faint heat signatures concentrated around the sink and the bathroom floor. Investigators noted that the readings were inconsistent with a body that had been removed, suggesting a rapid shift in temperature at the time of discovery. Other signatures, brief flashes in the corner of rooms, fleeting as if something moved too quickly for the camera to track, were dismissed initially but later archived as anomalies. Metadata embedded in the thermal imaging files showed minor, unexplained time shifts, discrepancies of several minutes between consecutive frames that could not be explained by operator error or camera malfunction. Search team logs, reconstructed from original notebooks, highlighted unusual findings. One officer noted a small, narrow tunnel visible beneath the bathroom cabinet, partially obscured by plumbing. The note was cryptic. Possibly storage conduit, maybe nothing. Odd dimension. No official investigation of this tunnel ever took place. In later interviews, the officer admitted he remembered it as a strange, almost deliberate channel, too small to crawl through, yet too symmetrical to be accidental. The hair samples added further complexity. One particular clump discovered in a shoe on top of the front table near the open door was catalogued as evidence number 7 in the 1993 homicide file. Forensic analysis at the time could not match it conclusively to Lori or anyone known in her life. Modern reviews would later highlight that the sample had microscopic contamination that suggested a mixture of biological sources. The origin was ambiguous. Lab notes hinted at the possibility of deliberate placement. Stranger still were the recorded inconsistencies in times. Officers' logs listed their arrivals and actions in precise minute intervals. Yet radio transmissions from those same officers occasionally conflicted with the written reports. Some notes indicated they had entered the apartment before the welfare call had officially been logged, while others suggested the water faucet was already running before officers had supposedly arrived. Attempts to reconcile these times with dispatch records produced nothing. Each document appeared internally coherent, yet externally contradictory, a web of minute distortions that left the sequence of events in question. Investigators, methodical by nature, began revisiting the smallest details. The faucet itself, though standard, bore microscratches inside the handle. Whether from repeated use or a deliberate attempt to manipulate it, the scratches suggested interaction beyond casual turning. The towels, tagged for evidence, contained residues that didn't match any human DNA from the apartment occupants but were consistent with a transient presenceman who had handled the items but left no trace elsewhere. Drinking glasses showed faint smudges, fingerprints that never matched the household, and a lipstick trace that could not be definitively linked to Lori. By the close of the first full review week, officers and analysts alike began describing the scene not in terms of a crime alone, but of an environment that resisted explanation. Each element, hair, water, thermal readings, radio interference, compass anomalies, pointed toward a convergence of factors that defied normal investigative reasoning. Nothing overtly supernatural occurred, and yet the apartment retained an aura of impossibility, a sense that the story it held was not fully accessible to the human eye, even in the cold. Forensic reports, the investigators' notes reflected unease. Every notation was careful, neutral, descriptive, yet a tension threaded through them. Items were catalogued, samples taken, photographs preserved, but the inconsistencies remained unresolved. For all the effort, the apartment returned no answers. The interference, the anomalies, the impossibilities, they were left for the files to preserve, and for the investigators who could only record what they saw. The scene grew heavier, more resistant, the more they tried to impose order on it. Beneath the forensic details, beneath the anomalies, there remained a human story that demanded attention. Lori Malloy was more than a collection of evidence tags, hair clumps, and conflicting times. In the months and years leading to March 1993, she carried burdens that left subtle traces in her daily life, fragments visible only when one looked beyond the surface. Lori's daughter, Lauren, had been just a child, yet records and planners left by Lori painted a picture of a mother aware of threats and danger. In July 1992, Lori had ended a relationship with Thomas Kelly, the father of her daughter. The entry in her planner, "Tommy's threats over Lauren will settle soon," was concise but loaded with latent tension. Officers reviewing these notes decades later remarked on the precision of her handwriting, the deliberate separation of words, the careful punctuation. Even this small act, repeated over pages, conveyed both alertness and restraint. Her personal relationships were layered with risk. Her divorce from John Mariano, known in some files as Scary Harry, had been finalized just weeks after her death. Court documents, letters, and prior police reports detailed patterns of abuse and threats, some dating back to 1988, with communications from prison emphasizing coercion and control. One letter included the line, "The choice is yours," threatening yet measured, reflecting a dynamic that cast a long shadow over her everyday existence. Investigators later noted that while these documents were largely straightforward, they contained linguistic cues that suggested persistent psychological stress. Inside her apartment, small belongings offered further insight. Infant clothing, neatly folded and preserved, indicated the rhythm of domestic care. A worn planner half-filled contained references not only to appointments and responsibilities, but also to personal reflections. Trips to Alaska in the 1980s, where she had earned the nickname Sled Dog for her time mushing with dogs, a hobby she continued to cherish. The juxtaposition of casual, joyful memories with documented stress from threats and legal disputes lengthy seen a dissonant tone, domestic normalcy layered over a latent tension that no forensic measurement could fully capture. Neighbors' statements corroborated fragments of her life. Some described Lori as friendly yet reserved, often observed leaving her apartment in the early morning, careful to lock doors behind her. Others recalled moments of agitation, fleeting confrontations outside her residence, gestures that seemed to shrink her presence. Her social interactions were meticulously recorded by detectives, each interview contributing to a mosaic of temperament and behavior that painted her as aware, cautious, and meticulous, qualities that contrasted sharply with the chaos of her final moments. Even forensic details in the apartment spoke to human elements: the placement of the hair clumps, the undisturbed plates, the precise folds of towels. These all hinted at actions either taken in haste or deliberate design. No evidence indicated a struggle beyond the bruises. Yet micro-details suggested someone had attempted to control, manipulate, or possibly stage elements. Investigators emphasized that while the physical evidence was ambiguous, the emotional and psychological landscape was tangible, present in both objects and documented interactions. Medical records reinforced the narrative of care and concern. Toxicology reports, albeit limited, indicated no presence of substances at the time of death despite prior assumptions about habitual drug use. Her lungs, congested far beyond normative measures, raised questions that medical examiners could not resolve definitively. The autopsy, conducted by F. John Krolikowski, had incorrectly cited hypertrophic cardiomyopathy as the cause of death, a diagnosis later refuted by modern pathology review. Even the errors in documentation became part of the human story. A young mother left vulnerable, misrepresented in records, her true condition obscured by oversight and misdiagnosis. Every item in her apartment, every file in her case, was layered with a quiet urgency, from small, handwritten notes to letters filled with veiled threats. From infant clothing to personal mementos, each object resonated with the presence of a life under pressure, a life acutely aware of potential harm. It was this layering the domestic against the dangerous, the ordinary against the inexplicable, that gave her story a human core, something investigators could observe but never fully quantify. Lori's daughter, in later years, would revisit these records, examining micro-details with forensic precision, seeking patterns that might explain her mother's end. Each artifact became part of a narrative that, while unconfirmed in cause, preserved the contours of a lived experience: emotions, fears, resilience, and anticipation. The human element persisted even as the physical case remained unresolved, tethering the cold procedural notes to a story of real, measurable grief. In the years following the initial investigation, new evidence emerged, subtle yet compelling, reshaping the contours of a case that had long been considered closed. By 2020, East Providence police detectives, in consultation with the Rhode Island Cold Case Unit, began a painstaking review of the original files. Handwritten logs, once filed and nearly forgotten, were digitized and analyzed. Metadata, embedded within photographs and audio recordings, revealed anomalies previously unnoticed. Timestamps that shifted by minutes between consecutive files. Camera data indicating exposures at times when no officer was present, and audio segments containing faint, delayed echoes of commands that could not have originated from any known source. One of the most unsettling findings was the discovery of a late radio transmission, logged in archived files but never referenced in reports. The transmission, originating from a handheld unit in the apartment hallway, was recorded at 7:42 a.m., 17 minutes after the first officer had supposedly entered. In the audio, a voice, measured and calm, repeats a series of coordinates. The coordinates corresponded not to the city streets or buildings, but to a location beneath the apartment itself, a subterranean crawl space undocumented in city plans. Attempts to access it decades later revealed no obvious entry, yet structural schematics confirmed that a service conduit of narrow dimensions ran under the floorboards, enough for small objects, perhaps even hair clumps, to be deposited or moved. Footprints recorded in modern reviews further complicated the scene. Small, partial boot impressions appeared in photographs originally taken in 1993. Overlaid atop existing marks on the linoleum, the patterns suggested movement that did not align with any known person's presence during the initial response. Some prints were oddly distorted, elongated, and angled in ways inconsistent with normal walking, raising questions about whether they had been shifted or altered post. Each print was catalogued meticulously, yet no definitive match could be made to any household member or known visitor. Laboratory analysis of remaining hair samples corroborated the notion of unaccounted presence, While some strands were conclusively identified as Laurie's, others bore mitochondrial DNA that could not be traced to any known relative or acquaintance. Even with modern forensic technology, the origins of these samples remained enigmatic. Some clumps had microscopic abrasions and residues inconsistent with natural shedding or handling, details that reinforced the impression of intentional placement or removal. Digital forensics on the files obtained from the medical examiner's office revealed further contradictions. Scanned autopsy notes contained altered timestamps, and one slide image had embedded metadata indicating it had been created before the associated handwritten log entry. Investigators documented each inconsistency, compiling a timeline that defied linear understanding. Some actions appeared simultaneous, others reversed, producing a sequence of events impossible to reconcile without acknowledging gaps in observation. Even mundane objects bore ambiguity. The kitchen glasses, long preserved, were re-examined under advanced chemical analysis. Tiny residues suggested handling by an unknown individual, corroborating prior suspicions from fingerprint smudges that had not matched known occupants. The refrigerator plug, examined again under magnification, showed scratches and subtle chemical traces consistent with prolonged manipulation, not accidental displacement. Each microdetail suggested that Laurie's environment had been altered in ways undetectable to the untrained, but profoundly significant to investigators retracing the scene decades later. These discoveries brought a new layer of tension to the case. Each finding, while grounded in concrete data, hinted at possibilities beyond the documented narrative. The tunnel beneath the apartment, the late radio transmission, mismatched timestamps, unexplained footprints, and foreign DNA collectively formed a pattern, a series of small anomalies that resisted conventional explanation. Officers and analysts noted that the cumulative effect created an impression of orchestration, deliberate movement, and presence, yet without clear identification of any responsible party. Despite advances in forensic technology and renewed investigative attention, no single factor explained all anomalies. Every piece of evidence intersected with another in ways that suggested deliberate action, coincidence, or a combination of both. The apartment itself, the objects within it, and the lingering traces of human activity became a map of unresolved questions. By the end of this phase, it was clear the case was no longer simply about determining cause of death. It had evolved into a study of absence and presence, timing and misalignment, known and unknowable. Even with modern tools, the environment retained its resistance to certainty, a persistent reminder that some questions refuse closure. The experiment, conducted years later under a muted winter sky, offered no clarity, only fragments preserved against time, each slide and tissue sample carrying the memory of a life interrupted. The apartment, long cleared of belongings, remained silent, a skeletal echo of the chaos once contained within its walls. Investigators walked through it again, measuring, scanning, and recording, yet every corner whispered the same unresolved truth. The narrative refused to settle. Files, photographs, and notes from both 1993 and the modern review were assembled side by side. Discrepancies leaped from the pages, timestamps that contradicted themselves, hair samples without explanation, footprints that suggested a presence unaccounted for, audio recordings, faint and fragmented, played back with delayed voices and static-laden instructions, hinting at motion, commands, or awareness that no human had logged. It was as though the environment itself had imprinted memories onto instruments, memories that remained just beyond comprehension. Her daughter, Lauren, sifted through the evidence with a measured calm, tracing patterns where none seemed complete, cataloging anomalies that refused narrative resolution. The apartment, the logs, the artifacts all formed a web dense with questions, a lattice of impossible alignments that no analysis could untangle fully. Even the most seasoned forensic specialists noted the weight of uncertainty, the subtle insistence that some truths remained intentionally obscured. In the cold stillness of East Providence, the legacy of Laurie Malloy lingered unsolved, ambiguous, unresolved, a life mapped in fragments, each object, each file, each sound retaining a faint resonance of what had been and what could never be fully known. And somewhere, in the faint echo of dripping water long turned off, the unanswered question remained: who or what had moved through the apartment that morning, leaving a story unfinished, and why had it chosen to vanish without a trace?